Okay, friends, this week we are studying the prayer that Jesus prays on behalf of himself, on behalf of the disciples, and it's such a beautiful prayer. And this day's reading, for me, is my favorite part of this prayer because I think it has such an important message, not just for the original disciples, but for us today. I've heard so many people over the years talk about what it means to be in the world, but not of the world, and what does that actually mean? And I think Jesus gives us an answer into that in the way that he prays for his disciples. He's talking to God and he says to them in verse 14, we're in chapter 17, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, for they are not of the world any more than I am of the world. So Jesus is saying, I've given them the word, and the word is this new Torah that Jesus has been teaching them from the beginning of John. He's created in them a new sheep pen, for example. Like he has created for them this new community that doesn't just live by the Torah, it lives by this new kingdom way of life, this new thing that Jesus has been creating in the world. It's his word, like what John talks about in chapter 1. Jesus has created this new kind of community, not of his own accord, but from the Father, this word that comes from God. And Jesus says the world's hated them because of it. Why is that? I think it's because they're two completely different kinds or ways of living. You have the way of Jesus and you have the way of the world. In meteorology, we think of these as like two different kinds of air masses. You have a hot air mass and a cold air mass. And when the two of those meet together, you get natural instability. When the way of Jesus interacts with the way of the world, what do you get? You get instability. You get friction between the two. And Jesus is saying this is exactly what's happening to the disciples. They are going to experience persecution and hostility and all these symptoms of instability because you have two completely different entities that are mixing or bumping up against each other. And so Jesus says, my prayer is not that you take them out of the world, like don't remove them altogether. Instead, protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. And here's the best part. Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is the truth. See, I think Jesus knows something to be true of ourselves. Whenever we come in contact with the world, the natural inclination, right? It's the same thing that happens when two air masses meet, is there's instability, but then they start to mix and things settle down into this new equilibrium. Jesus doesn't want that to happen. Jesus doesn't want his disciples, the people who follow the way of Jesus, to hit with the world and mix to like form this kind of new equilibrium, to give in. Jesus is saying, no, Father, protect them from that because they are not of the world. That word, whenever you see it used in John's gospel, of, is actually the Greek word ek, and it means from. It means your source or where you're from is not of the world. We, as followers of Jesus, have a new source. Our source of living, the way we go about our everyday patterns of thinking, patterns of behaving, or habits are not from the world. They're from the Word, the way of Jesus, the new Torah that he's given us. And so, of course, it's going to come in conflict with the way that the world operates. Its source is here. Jesus links it to the evil one. I think that's interesting. Don't have time to get into it today. But I think when Jesus says sanctify them, sanctify is just a word for make it holy. Holy just means set apart for special purposes. Jesus is saying, God, don't let them come to an equilibrium with the world. Don't let them settle. Don't let them give in to the way that the world wants them to live. Sanctify them. Keep them separate. Keep them separated out for special purposes. Keep them holy. Jesus is asking the Father to protect his sheep, to keep them from mixing with the world. Don't get uncomfortable when you come against that instability, right? When you bump up against the world. Don't be surprised. That's what he's been talking about, that you're going to face instability in that. But don't also then give in to the temptation to change the way you think or behave to be better fit with the world. we as Christians have to be comfortable with that that hard space between where we live in contrast with the world. But then we cannot ever lose our Jesus-given responsibility to follow the way even when it gets hard, even when it leads us to be different from the world. Why? Because our source is not the world. We are not of the world. We're not from the world at all. We are from the way of Jesus. And Jesus here prays that we would not give in to that temptation, but we would be sanctified. We would be set apart and continue to be set apart. This is not the natural way of the world by any stretch of the imagination. But I think for you and for me this week, what we have to keep in mind is that we are set aside for special purpose. What we do in this life is learn the way of Jesus so that we can follow that to the best of our ability. We are always growing in our spiritual formation. We are continuing to become more and more like Jesus because we read this book and we follow this new way of living that Jesus lays out for us. And there are going to be times where we bump up against the world. And Jesus knew that about us. He basically told his followers to prepare for that. And while you and I, that won't look like persecution in every case in what we think of the word persecution meaning, it will look like the temptation for us to just give a little here and there, to mix with the world, to not follow that thing that Jesus said because it actually will help us fit in better. We can't reach that new equilibrium. We have to stay separate. We have to make sure that we know in every case that we are living a different way. Now, this does not mean that we don't participate in the world, right? Like that's the opposite extreme to like, we're never going to do anything that the world does. We're not going to watch worldly things or listen to worldly things. Like we're not going to become a cult where we live separate from the world, shut off, and we only do like Jesus things. There is a case to be made for understanding the world, right? And living in the world, but not making it our source of living. And I think that's the balance that we have to strike. We have to remain sanctified, set aside for special purpose. We have to remain in the way of Jesus. That's our source. The world is not our source. And where the two things come in conflict, where you'll find that in your life, is where there's natural instability, like two air masses meeting. If you're finding areas in your life that feel unstable because you feel like you're mixing up against the world, that's actually okay. We have to be okay with that kind of occurrence. And I think that can speak to what Jesus is trying to do in our lives. I hope that helps. This is how I'm reading this passage and what it's speaking to me this week. It's just to reminding myself that our source is not this world. Our source is Jesus and the new way that he came to bring us. And that may cause some instability from time to time, but we are supposed to be separate. We are sanctified, and that's what Jesus wanted for us from the very beginning. Amen.